everyone, and welcome to the Matillion Meets podcast. For this next episode, we're joined by a very exciting new guest, new to Matillion, our new CRO, Eric Benson. Eric, welcome to the Matillion Meets podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Of course. It's lovely to have you in Manchester. So you've obviously got a very impressive career history, having worked at AWS, Microsoft, and of course now Matillion. So it's going to be a great episode getting to know a little bit more about you, introducing you to the business, and also hearing exciting things that you've got planned and what you're going to be bringing to Matillion and your vision for our future and where you're planning to take our sales team. So we'll start off, why don't you give us a little bit of an introduction as to who Eric Benson is, where you come from, because I know you've had a bit of a nomadic upbringing. You're from here, there, everywhere. So it'd be quite exciting to hear kind of where you've grown up and where you're from.
Sure. I had a pretty interesting background, I think, kind of an interesting mix of DNA. So my father was a physician in the military.
Nice.
So before he was a doctor, he was a Special Forces Green Beret. So if you think about discipline and process, definitely got that aspect from him. And my mom's a psychologist. So she kind of instilled in me this, curiosity about human nature. And so you mix the two between understanding humans and then feeling like you've got a good handle on discipline and process. It really ultimately made for the great combination to be into, a business leader.
Yeah.
Because you really, sales is ultimately the kind of combination of art and science.
Yeah.
And so the mix of art and science really ultimately, at the end of the day, is how you make a successful career.
Definitely. And so you told me an interesting fact. We had a meeting before, and you were telling me about how you grew up in, well, you were born in Japan? Or you grew
I was
up
born in Japan. So my
Yes.
dad was stationed over in Japan for a couple of years. And then we lived in Hawaii, South Carolina, Washington, D.C. area, Colorado Springs, Seattle area. So a little bit of everywhere growing up. So moved every couple of years, and then professionally have been mostly Pacific Northwest between Seattle, Portland, and now I live just outside of Bend, Oregon.
Nice.
So during the pandemic, got to move down to our vacation place.
Very nice.
It's near an airport, so it works out for me to travel just every bit as conveniently as being based in Seattle, but without all the lovely rain. So I'm here in Manchester, and right now it's Fahrenheit, high 50s, rainy, a little muggy.
It would not be a trip to Manchester without some rain. So.
And this is exactly like what Seattle feels like 10 months a year. So I feel very much at home. So thank you for arranging this.
Of course. So I just told the gods to bring down the rain today, just for you.
And then professionally have been, West Coast based, between California and Pacific Northwest, with a couple short stints on the East Coast, but otherwise mostly a West Coast based U.S., but really happy to be here and look forward to spending a lot more time in the U.K. and building out other parts of the world for Matillion.
Well, we're very excited to have you, obviously, as part of the company. So why don't you give us a bit of an insight into kind of your career history as well? So obviously you've had a very impressive career history, like I said, having worked, I think it was over a decade at AWS, and then I think around 3 years at Microsoft as well. So massive companies, obviously probably worked on some very exciting things. So give us a bit of an insight into how you've got to where you are today.
Yeah. Well, if you asked me that 20 years ago, I would have told you that, career progression is very linear. It just goes up and to the right. It's actually much more circuitous. And part of that is just the nature of technology, the nature of business, companies getting acquired, things change. If you ask a lot of CEOs how they got to their role, most of them will say it was a combination of circumstances and intentionality. Right. And I would say that's kind of how I feel about it. It's intentionality of putting myself in the right place at the right time, but also been very fortunate for some circumstances that happened. So, for instance, when I was at Microsoft, and this is nothing against our brethren over there, they're great partners, but they were a very PC-centric company in the late 2000s. So, and I was over there from 2007 to 2009. And they were very focused on making sure their business was going to remain on the personal computer. And here we've got this little company called AWS, founded inside of Amazon. It was a startup inside of Amazon, very focused on selling cloud infrastructure services to scale, internet-based services only, not anything related to hardware. And so it was really a different vision. And I ultimately got introduced to them in late 2009. Ended up going over there in the beginning of 2010 as employee number 12. So I feel like I've worked in a startup per se, even though it was a Fortune 100 company. AWS was its own company and funded, built entirely out of the DNA of Amazon. Yet it was its own separate LLC, so truly in its own company. And so I was very fortunate, right, that coming from Microsoft and being so clearly seeing the circumstances. So here's where I'm going back to where where sometimes it's intentionality, sometimes the circumstances present themselves. I feel like I was very fortunate to happen to be introduced to AWS early in the cloud computing infrastructure world.
Yeah.
And it was primarily the digitally native companies we've all heard about now that seem like household names. But back then, a little company called Airbnb was coming up.
Yes.
I worked with Doug Systrom from Instagram in the summer of 2010 when it was this little app on the App Store, and Amazon had a couple thousand hits, and they were trying to figure out how to architect an app that could scale.
Yeah.
And a few months later, they've got 1 million hits a week, and then they got acquired by Facebook. And so it was, just a series of events that happens over the course of a career. So I spent a few years, focused on, really building out digitally native companies onto the platform. And then mid 2014, 15 is right when the enterprise really started to lean into cloud computing. So all of a sudden you had Capital One and Nike and, big major global corporations really leaning in. And so I was very fortunate. And from there, left to go to VMware to run cloud services based on AWS, but also building out the Microsoft and Google partnerships with VMware. And then, fortuitously, this company called Broadcom comes along and acquires VMware. Otherwise, I'd still be there. I love VMware. It's a great company. But I'm also very fortunate and glad to be here. And sometimes the circumstances dictate what's going to happen. So I spent several months looking for that next right role. And when I met Matthew and met the team at Matillion, it just seemed like the perfect combination of great technology that is really in the right place at the right time for where the macroeconomic conditions are going, with the explosion of data in the enterprise and the need to do analytics and now artificial intelligence.
Yeah. So you've had obviously your hand in some very exciting companies and obviously probably some very exciting projects and so forth. And obviously now you're here with us at Matillion. And you mentioned obviously when you met Matthew and the team, it kind of felt like the right fit. So in your opinion, why do you think Matillion is so poised for success? Like, why were you so excited to join our team? We're we're growing, we're still growing. So what is it that kind of really hooked you in?
Yeah. So I think about, choosing career decisions is really around, 3 different lenses. One is around the technology, right? So it has to be game-changing technology, which I think Matillion has.
Yeah.
It's got a legacy product that's very popular. It's got a newer DPC product, and now with the AI offering, it's really poised to, really explode over the enterprise in the course of the next decade. So there's the macroeconomic conditions around technology. With the explosion of data, if you look at enterprise, data is growing at 27% compounded year over year. No one's IT budget's growing at 27% year over year. So therein is a problem statement that Matillion can help solve. Next is the people. So if you look at, there's a lot of founder CEOs that are much different personalities, much different influences on their company. I think, Matthew and the executive team really lets people lead in their own ways. There's no single way to do things at Matillion. They bring in different personalities that all can focus on what they're really good at and bring their strengths. And then you look at the culture. And I think what really attracted me was this idea of, having high standards and having high integrity, but also leading with humility.
Yeah.
And I just love that aspect of the culture, and it allows people to really be themselves, but yet bring their best parts of themselves to work. So really that combination of those 3 things, really attracted me to Matillion. And going back to the macro piece, I think if you look at where companies are going with migrating to the cloud, with the explosion of data, with the need to understand what's happening in their data, there's a lot of companies out there, but I think Matillion has a really unique offering that can really help grow and expand and solve business problems ultimately, which is at the end of the day, the way we're going to be successful.
Yeah, no, definitely. And obviously you've now had a chance to obviously be in our Denver office.
Yeah.
Now this is your first time at our Manchester office, meeting our rest of world team. Hopefully you've had a chance to obviously start to get settled in at least. I find that Matillion's kind of like a time warp. Time goes very quickly. And obviously having an extensive career history in leadership, sales leadership, I assume you're going to bring with you maybe a slightly different leadership stance. What is your approach to leadership, and what kind of leadership style are you going to bring to our Matillion team?
Yeah, like I said, go back to the culture piece, because I think ultimately that's what really attracts me. So it's, bringing high standards, but ultimately letting people do what they're really good at. So I'm a firm believer in, strengths-based leadership and allowing people to really be themselves. There's no one way to sell. There's no one way to do things, but we all have to align around a certain core set of values that we believe in, enabling our customers to be successful, delighting and obsessing over their success. Bringing our best selves, our high integrity, our high standards, but realize that ultimately we're here to help serve our customers. So my leadership style is really around, I believe that my job is to enable my team and the wider team to be successful. It's really allowing people the opportunity to grow and to really align on a vision, which is where, ultimately where we're going to go.
Yeah, no, I love that. And yeah, basically enabling your team to, like you said, grow and become the best versions of themselves. But obviously, like you said, having in mind that delighting the customer piece and that they are the focus. And we've heard a lot, obviously, we've had Super All Hands at the start of this financial year, where we heard a lot about delighting the customer. So I'm curious to hear from your stance, having just joined. Again, I'm asking you a lot about what you're going to bring and your vision for the future, but I'm curious to hear what that delighting the customer piece means to you and kind of how you're going to approach that going forward.
Yeah, I think ultimately at the end of the day, like I said, we're here to solve business problems. So if we focus on the outcomes that our customers want to achieve, which is better analytics for their data, understanding insights, customer sentiment analysis, analytics about where they should invest, how to help them be more agile and make better decisions. If we align around those business problems that we're going to solve for our customers, that's how we're going to be successful.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm curious, so you've probably had a lot of guidance and mentorship and just, support from people throughout your career history. So if you were to give one piece of advice to other people, whether they're just starting out in the career or they're 10 years in, whatever, what is that one piece of advice maybe you've gotten or observe someone else doing that you'd like to pass on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can give a lot of advice. So let me see if I can encapsulate it. I learned a lot from different companies I've worked for, different leaders. Like when I was at AWS, it was a small enough company back then. Jeff Bezos used to come into our QBRs and give a lot of advice about how he's been successful and built Amazon so far. So a couple of nuggets that I maybe picked up from that time at my life was be really rigid in your vision about what you want, but be flexible in the way you get there. Because I mentioned earlier, circumstances change, underlying circumstances can change and you have to remain super adaptable, but be really, really rigid in the vision that you want, but just adaptable into how you get there. It's going to be not a linear straight line. It's going to be very circuitous with different influences along the way. So be very, very rigid about your vision, but be flexible about how you get there. And ultimately, I think the other piece is, we're living in a world that's a lot different now than it was, when I was coming up into the career business world. And the paths to get there are not quite as straight and narrow. So ultimately, the piece of advice I'd give is invest in yourself and really be a lifelong learner. I think the other piece from Microsoft, I love what Satya has done with Microsoft culture, where they've gone from a culture of, quote unquote, know-it-alls to a culture of what they call learn-it-alls. And I love the growth mindset of, I may not know everything, but I'm gonna do my best to learn everything. And ultimately that's where, with the changing technology world, where we all need to get to, is starting from a place of, I will never know it all, but I can learn as much as I can and try to pass that on to others inside the organization and to customers. Ultimately, that's what we're good at.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I might be biased because I'm in talent development, but I definitely think, everyone should be trying to learn as much as they can. And I think maybe people might have a perception that once you've reached the level you're at, being a CRO at a business, that's probably like the highest you can get. And there you've done it, no more further to go. But I assume you probably disagree with that. What is it that you do?
I feel like I'm just getting started, to be honest. I mean, I've been in this business for 25 years in technology. And I still feel like it's, this is week 6 for me here. It feels like day 6, but also feels like month 6 in other ways. But at the end of the day, I'm still learning and I'll always be learning. And when it comes to professional development, I still block time in my calendar every single week of my career to work on something, to make myself better so that I have more to offer customers, more to offer the company, more to offer others. And so ultimately, I live my own values. So when I say invest in yourself, I really mean it.
You do mean it,
and go and do the amount of information out there right now, whether it's, YouTube or, other professional development areas, there's free information out there. And so for us not to take advantage of it is just a shame.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's very impressive that even obviously at the level you're at, you still block out the time to dedicate to your own development. Because I think you'll probably hear it here at Matillion a lot. Like everyone says, there's not enough hours in the day. There's so much work to do. And like, it's very easy to make excuses for yourself. It's like, I haven't got time to do this. I haven't got time to do that. But yeah, just blocking out an hour of your week to spend reading a book or listening to a podcast or reading an article. It can do so much. And obviously you don't want to be left behind and everyone else is advancing themselves and you're still probably where you were like 3-5 years ago. So no, I love that little piece of advice. And I need to do it more as well, be more strict with myself. And so it's very easy to stop.
The other piece of advice I'd say is just ask. You'd be surprised at how many people want to be able to help. I think we're afraid, people get certain titles and they say, oh, I can never go talk to that person. And I think that we just need to ask. Ultimately, if you look back to the days of, you remember a story about Steve Jobs, when he was just a teenager, he called up, one of the founders of Hewlett Packard that he, found in the phone book. And just introduced himself, phoned him at home and said, my name's Steve. I want to learn about how to make computers. Would you be willing to meet with me? And this, they did. And I think that, it's not the same world nowadays, but at the same time, you'd be surprised at the number of people who want to be able to help the next generation coming into the business world. And all you got to do is ask. The worst that can someone say is no, or I'm busy.
Exactly.
But if you don't ask, then, then someone else can't help.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's probably, I know it's a very common piece of advice, but when people say the worst someone can say is no, it's very true. Like that's something I've always carried with me, and I've pushed myself to ask for help more, ask for things more, and just put myself out there. Because like I said, the worst they can say is no, and most people are just very much willing to help.
That's right.
So no, definitely great piece of advice there. So something I'm interested to know, get to know you a little bit more. We'll go into more of a personal side, deep dive into Eric Benson behind the professional screen.
Sure.
Can you give us a bit an insight as to who you are outside of work? I know you've obviously you showed me a picture of your beautiful family today, so maybe a little bit about them. So maybe who Eric Benson really is.
So I mentioned I've got 2 teenagers. So in the U.S., we're still, they call it high school. So we're 11th grade and 9th grade. So my son is now looking at colleges. We made a couple trips around the U.S. to look at different schools. So he'll be going off a year from now. He'll be finished with a senior year. He'll go off, and my daughter's a freshman. So she's got 3 more years ahead of her. But outside of work, I love the outdoors. So one of the reasons we moved down to our vacation place during the pandemic was access to ski resorts, whitewater rafting, mountain climbing, hiking. I play a lot of golf, so I love golf. Got into it as an adult. It's kind of my obsession right now, to be continuously getting better at things. Like I mentioned, being a continuous learner. Golf is one of those things that you'll never master, but you can always get better. So I'm sort of addicted to that idea of getting better at something all the time.
Nice.
In my creative side, I'm not good at, I have no artistic ability. So stick figures on the whiteboard is about as good as I'll get. I love music. I'm not a musician. I don't even think I'm really good at listening to music. But creativity wise, I love to cook. And I'm always researching recipes. I love to go out to eat. I love to try new restaurants. And ultimately think of myself as sort of a lifelong learner when it comes to that. And that's something I can share with others, which I like a lot. And I collect a little bit of wine. So I got into wine collecting the last few years. Living in the Pacific Northwest, we've got access to great Pinot Noirs from Oregon, and Walla Walla is sort of an up-and-coming area of Washington State, where a lot of the ex-vintners from Napa Valley, when they couldn't afford to live there anymore, moved up to Washington, and now they're producing some amazing Cabernets out of that area. So I definitely got into that on the side. Like I mentioned, there's not enough hours in the day to do all the things I like to do.
No, that's great hobbies there. So you've got a good balance between like the relaxing wine and food, and then the more outdoorsy stuff. I mean, you definitely share our love for, I say we share a love for wine. I don't know much about all the fancy stuff and the different notes and all the technical things, but I like to drink it, and I love going out to eat. So we do share that. So I'm curious, you said you love food. You go like going out to eat, exploring different things. What's your, actually, no, I was going to ask what's your favorite cuisine, which I'll still answer that if you'd like to. But I want to know maybe what's the weirdest thing you've tried, or the most out there thing you've ever tried.
Oh, wow. So I was fortunate the last couple of years I was at Amazon. I did have a global job, so I was traveling all over the world. And there's some really interesting cuisine in Asia. And so in Taiwan, there's an area called Snake Alley down in this area called Keelung, where you can go on. They have street food where they've got fried scorpion. You can try snake. And So I did try some. I can't say I tried everything there. Some of it's just a little beyond the pale. So certain areas, I may have to draw the line. So yeah, no insects for me. I just can't do it.
So what did you try then?
I tried steak.
You did try steak. What does that taste like? I imagine it to be quite not like fish, but maybe it's because it's got scales.
It's in between fish and chicken. People can say it does consistency of like chicken.
Yeah.
And in the States, of course, you go down in the South, you can try alligator and you can try.
Yes, I have tried alligator once actually. Yeah, that was cool. So that is pretty weird, and I don't know if I could be able to try snake. Yeah. But what is your favorite cuisine then?
Yeah, so I'm naturally, I joke now because I'm sitting here in the beautiful, Manchester. It's much like Seattle where I used to live. It's definitely cloudy. I think that's why I love sunshine. Yeah. So any sunshine related cuisine in the Mediterranean, so very Italian, nice. Southern French, Spanish. I just spent some time in Barcelona recently. Yeah. I love Spain. I love all the cuisine of the sunny areas of the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm.
No, definitely. I think that's one of the best as well. And Barcelona is a brilliant city. It's one of my favorites in Europe as well. So my next question for you, I know we've already mentioned obviously about continuous development and you spend that whole hour a week on improving or learning something new. But I want to know if there's any like books or podcasts or TV shows that you're obsessed with, whether it is something to do with professional development or maybe something that's trash reality TV that just takes your mind off the week ahead.
Sure.
What is it that like kind of gets you excited and helps you wind down?
Yeah. So from a professional development point of view, I'd say a couple of things that I'm really spent a lot of time researching and reading about the last couple of years. One is, the growth mindset I mentioned earlier about always growing and learning and just going out and just realizing you don't have to fight for a piece of the pie. You can go out and create your own pie altogether. And I love that mentality. The second one is around, there's a gentleman named Paul Stoltz who came through and gave a training that I was a part of recently in the last couple of years called the adversity quotient. Nice. And so if you think about, IQ being, your native intelligence for book learning and EQ being your emotional quotient for, understanding people, he has a thing he talks about called AQ, which is adversity quotient. Okay. So it's your ability to deal with unexpected obstacles or developing ultimately what, in sports teams, they call it grit. Yeah. It's just that unwilling to accept defeat. I'm unwilling to accept that. Yeah. I'm just going to keep fighting no matter what, even when it's almost an irrational decision you have that I'm just going to ignore the circumstances that tell me I can't do this. I'm going to go out and I'm going to do it no matter what. Yeah. And ultimately, I love that idea. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that and developing like adversity quotient. From a podcast point of view, I'm a bit of a history buff, actually.
Oh, really?
And so I like learning about, not just, European history and, the last 100 years, but, ancient Roman history, a little bit of everything. Yeah. And there's a gentleman named Dan Carlin that runs a podcast called Hardcore History that you can find on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Nice. And it's just fascinating, the amount of research that he does. And he's such a gregarious individual when he does behind the microphone just to tell the stories. And, if I'm on an airplane or driving in the car and I put a podcast on, you can almost, you just visualize, everything from the way he talks about the uniforms, about the food that was involved, what the culture was like during this time. I just get enthralled with history podcasts. So I'm a bit of a history buff. Yeah, no, it's exciting. Kind of like being transported all the way back. And
it is. Getting taken through that story. Yeah. So do you love museums then? Is that something that really interests you as well?
My wife's family is actually, we're very different. So she comes from a family of professional artists. Right. Nice. As I mentioned, my family's a bit more on the medical side. So very different. So I've definitely learned a lot about art from her and her family. So I do spend some time in museums. But like I said, I have no artistic ability, so I don't even feel like I can appreciate it.
But at the same time, you can still appreciate it and look
beauty.
At it. Yeah.
I appreciate beauty. And especially, learning from people who do, I like people that do things that I can't do, right? That's why I think other people are interesting.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a great way to look at things. And my last question for you, which is a question that we ask everyone that comes on the podcast, just to get to know, purely from my personal curiosity, is I like to know people's music taste because I think it's a great way to get to know someone, because people either have some very weird music taste that you would never expect, or like they just don't listen to music at all and you can't fathom why. What if you had to pick 3 people to headline a festival that you're curating? So it could be people that are dead, alive, anyone throughout history. Who would those 3 people be and why?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I don't know if I can narrow it down to three. That's tough.
It's
That's
hard,
like someone
isn't
ask
it?
you,
Yeah.
what are the
Pick your favorite child.
yeah, right. Or pick what's the one album you'd bring to if you had to be on a desert island. And I don't know if I could pick one.
Yeah.
I'd say my musical tastes are a bit all over the place, right? So you can all tell I'm from a vintage where I was fortunate to have grown up in the 80s and really heard, right here from beautiful Manchester, New Order, Joy Division,
Yes.
some of the influences back then, the sort of the whole new wave music came out, when I was in high school with, Flock of Seagulls and Psychedelic Furs and, think about all the 80s albums that came out then, but also like rock music, right? I mean, I love the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
And I love U2. U2 is probably one of the bands that I have listened to or seen the most live in my musical following career.
Yeah.
So it'd be tough to narrow it down. But I do have a bit of an eclectic taste too.
Yeah. No, it's nice to hear that it spans from the UK side as well as like US bands as well. So that's exciting. No, that's a great insight. Thank you, Eric. It's been lovely to speak to you, and it's been lovely to get to know you a bit more. I'm sure we're all going to see you around the offices a lot more over the next coming months. But yeah, excited to have you join Matillion, and thank you for joining us on the Matillion Meets podcast. Please join us next time to see who Matillion will be meeting next.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.